I'll call the Tuesday, August 8th meeting of the Clatsop Planning Commission to order at this time. And if we could all could have a roll call, please.
Chair Farrar,
Present.
Clark Powers, he is here.
Aye.
Okay. Mike Magyar,
Present.
Katie Pritchard,
Present.
Carrie Johnson,
Here.
Jeremy Linder,
Here.
Jason Krauscher.
Here.
Can I have a motion to adopt the agenda or suggest a needed change?
I'll move that we adopt the agenda.
Been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda. All those in favor, please indicate by an aye.
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 Sounds like we
Aye.
have enough to approve the agenda, probably unanimously. Next item on agenda is business from the public. I see no one in the audience. Has there been anyone that's contacted the planning department or?
No, there has not.
We'll assume there's no business from the public today. And the main thing on the agenda today is 2 public hearings concerning ordinances on zoning and exclusive farm zone, which we'll take up first. And these are considered, I guess, a legislative hearing, and so we go through a little routine here. This is a legislative hearing regarding the ordinance 2311 concerning zoning changes in exclusive farm use zones in the county. Does any commissioner have a conflict of interest to report? I see none and hear none. If we could then begin with the staff report.
Thank you, Chair Farrar. Good morning, Commissioners. I'm Ian Sisson, Senior Planner with the Community Development Department. So in the Exclusive Farm Use Zone, or EFU, we have a provision for alteration, restoration, or replacement of a lawfully established dwelling. That is currently listed as a Type 2 use, so it requires a conditional use permit, which has a $1,200 application fee. It involves a public notice and a 10-day public comment period, and the process generally takes anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks, depending on our workload and the complexity of the application, which these applications typically are not very complex, and that is why we are proposing to move this to the list of uses that are permitted under a Type 1 procedure. So that would be a development permit, which we generally are able to issue over the counter or within a couple of days, and the application fee is $85. So it would be a significant reduction in the fee as well as the processing time. And we have determined as staff that it would still be a process where we could enforce the criteria or apply the criteria rather that are in statute in ORS 215.291, which is where this provision originally comes from, and our code just implements it. So we have determined, A, that it does not need to be a conditional use procedure, and B, that we could reasonably evaluate these applications under a Type 1 procedure and go through all of the same criteria that would apply. So it's just something that would make this process faster and cheaper for the applicant, and also easier for us to process as staff without going through a Type 2 process. So it's a simple change, again, just taking the existing provision from the section where it's listed as a Type 2 use and shifting it up to the preceding section where it would be listed as a type 1 use. Are there any questions?
Any questions from any of the commissioners? Anybody in the virtual world, because I have a little hard time seeing if somebody wants to say something from there. Anybody on Zoom would like to comment, just chime in. Don't hear anyone. I had one question, not to question the idea of doing this, but just for my own edification, I guess, is how do you define alteration? I mean, how much expansion might be allowed in an alteration? And would that also include going from, say, a single family to a multifamily, or?
So this would just be for a single-family dwelling. An alteration could include an interior remodel. It could include an addition. There's no limitation on the size of an addition. Similarly, if someone is to apply to replace a dwelling, an existing dwelling, you know, the existing dwelling could be very small, and they might replace it with a very large dwelling with more bedrooms than the original had. So there really aren't any limitations on the expansion in size of the dwelling. It is just one dwelling unit still.
Thank you for that. At this point, I guess there's no other questions from other commissioners or discussion. So at this point, we'll call for public testimony. I'll open the public hearing for taking comments or concerns from any member of the public that wants to give their opinion on this matter before us. And if there are any such people, you're asked to sign in and state your name and address for the record. And if you represent a other agency, to make that clear to this body, and limit your remarks to 3 minutes. And I have a feeling we don't have anyone, so that's just to make it official. If there is anybody out there, we want to hear from you, but doesn't sound like we have anyone this morning. With that, then we could move on to, well, I'll close the public hearing at this point and ask if there's any final questions from or discussion points that commissioners wish to make.
Is there in our packet, is there a proposed motion? Is this a recommendation to the Board of Commissioners, or?
There is no proposed motion, but we are asking for your recommendation of the proposed change to the Board of Commissioners.
Would you like to make that motion?
I will make the motion that we support and recommend approval of the amendments to ordinance 23-11, the exclusive farm use zone amendment. Recommend approval.
It's been moved by Commissioner Johnson.
I'll second that.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded now. Moved by Commissioner Johnson and seconded by, I believe, Commissioner Kraushaar. And that's to recommend to the Clatsop Board of Commissioners to adopt the proposed amendment for ordinance 2311 as laid out in this Planning Commission packet. All those, we'll take a vote on that by voice, since most of you are only voice present. Maybe we better go with a roll call so we have it clear.
Chair Farrar,
Aye.
Vice Chair Powers,
Aye.
Commissioner Magyar,
Aye.
Commissioner Pritchard,
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson,
Aye.
Commissioner Linder,
Aye.
Commissioner Kraushaar.
Aye.
Sounds like a unanimous vote, so the motion passes, and it'll be moved to the commissioners with our recommendation to approve. Thank you for that report and your assistance. And now,
Can I say something on that?
Yeah.
I view this as kind of a housekeeping measure of something that everybody realizes should be cleaned up and made a little simpler, and I would just, thank the staff for bringing this forward, but if there's more issues like that you see like this is the kind of thing that I like to see, to just clean up the process and make it easier for people that, especially on a replacement thing, that whole process, and your house burns down, and then you gotta go through this process of getting it replaced.
moving on to our third item, I guess, in the agenda. Similar legislative hearing to take up the issue of amending ordinance 23-12, geologic hazards overlay exemptions. And I'll ask if any commissioners on the Plan Commission have a conflict of interest to report. I hear none. And does anyone object to the jurisdiction of this body to hear this matter at this time? And nobody does. I don't think we have any public on board. If we could begin with a staff report on this, please.
Thank you, Chair Farrar. Again, Ian Sisson, Senior Planner. So this proposal is to amend the geologic hazards overlay. As I'm sure you all know, we have a geologic hazards overlay which regulates development in identified hazard areas. Most of what we deal with are landslide hazards and oceanfront hazards. There are a few others, but those are the primary landslide and oceanfront are the primary geologic hazards that we have in the county. We are required under statewide planning goal 7 to administer a program to regulate development in those identified geologic hazard areas. And again, that's achieved through the GHO. This is similar in a way to the previous ordinance that you just recommended to the board, in that it would make the permitting process a little bit easier. So what we're proposing to do is add a section of development activities that would be exempt from the requirement to go through the geologic hazard permit process. And the general idea with this is there are activities that are considered lower impact or lower risk, or they're regulated by some other state agency already, and so there's not a need for the county to review a geologic hazard report for those developments. So this is something that is identified in a guide that Dogami put together for local jurisdictions to develop land use planning codes around geologic hazards, and that was issued, I think, back in 2019. They published this guide called Preparing for Landslide Hazards. And in the guide, they have a model code, and they also look at several communities in Oregon and what's in their codes, and they have a lot of codes that were updated recently. I also, as I was putting some changes together for the GHO, reviewed Tillamook County's code. They just updated their geologic hazard overlay within the last couple of years. So also have been working with Dogami and DLCD staff on some updates to the code that will be coming to you later on, but this was something that we thought generally would be supported. It was supported by the board in a work session last week, and last year when we did a survey on potential updates to the geologic hazards overlay, the feedback that we got on adding exemptions was overall positive. So this is something that we feel is supported. One change to the list of 13 exemptions listed under 5.3020 Subsection 10 is for maintenance and repair of public and private roads, streets, parking lots, driveways, culverts, and utility lines, provided the work does not extend outside the existing right-of-way boundary. So, as I mentioned, we had a work session on this proposal with the Board of Commissioners last week. After the work session, I got some feedback from our interim Public Works Director, Terry Hendricks, and he requested that we remove the stipulation that this maintenance and repair work has to be within the limits of the right-of-way. So, as Terry described, they are doing a lot of culvert replacement work, and lately they've been running into an issue where the new culvert needs to extend 5 to 10 feet beyond the right-of-way boundary. And so that is something that would trigger a requirement for a full geologic hazard permit the way this is written. So he's requesting that we remove, provided the work does not extend outside the existing right-of-way boundary from subsection 10 here. So it would just read, maintenance and repair of public and private roads, streets, parking lots, driveways, culverts, and utility lines. And that would allow Public Works and ODOT, or other folks repairing roads or replacing culverts to do so, where, you know, again, the culvert might extend 10 feet or so beyond the right-of-way boundaries. And so as staff, that's something that, we feel is appropriate. And, one other thing that this proposal would do is extend the period a geologic hazard report is considered valid. So those reports are only good for 2 years right now. And folks always have the option to get a cover letter, to sort of refresh the validity of the report, so they could go back to their geologist, request a cover letter, stating that the findings in that report have not changed, or describe any changes that may have happened to their findings or recommendations. So this would extend that period. The reports are considered valid to 5 years from 2. And again, that's consistent with peer jurisdictions and the guide that Dogami published. So I think that is it. This is, again, the exemptions list, 13 exemptions. One proposed change to item 10 on that list, and then the extension from 2 years to 5 years. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you for that report. Planner Sisson, are there any questions from the planning commissioners or staff before I open the public hearing?
I have a couple.
Go ahead.
Going back to the possible changes you mentioned, about maintenance and repair of public and private roads, streets, parking lots, driveways, culverts, utility lines, provided the work does not extend outside of the existing right-of-way boundary. So if we remove the language, right-of-way boundary, that could apply for public and private individuals to do that literally anywhere, right?
It would, yeah. So if it's a road, street, parking lot, driveway, culvert, or utility line, I mean, that's almost always going to be within a right-of-way of some sort, whether it's a private easement or a public right-of-way. I'm not sure if I totally understand where, the question. I think maybe what you're asking is, will the private property owner outside the right-of-way boundary be affected by this, and will they have the opportunity to give permission for that work to occur? Is that what you're asking about?
I'm not in this case, I'm not just thinking that, but I'm
Okay.
just right-of-way boundary. I mean, language clearly means, to mean private roads, culverts, which could literally be anywhere. It doesn't have to be a road. So I don't have a problem with it. I'm just asking if that language.
It would, yeah. So a culvert that's not inside a right-of-way
Mhm.
could then theoretically be replaced, even if it's not part of a road.
Okay. Let's see, I had one other.
Well, on that point, though, just to expand on it, you mentioned, was there an interest in understanding if the property owner whose land may be affected by extending the project outside the right-of-way, do they have any recourse?
They do. They would need to sign the application. So if we were to receive a drawing set for, say, a culvert replacement, and that would typically include the right-of-way boundaries on it, and if we were to see that the new culvert was going to extend beyond those boundaries, we would make sure that on the permit application we had signatures from all of the affected private property owners that are adjacent to the right-of-way.
So I want to follow up with that, number 10 as well. So I just want to make sure that we don't have some kind of blanket permit for private owners to just waive the geological hazard, or to kind of claim geological hazard exemption just because they choose to do something, right? It's got to be, number 10 is in spirit if you're doing maintenance in a right-of-way and part of that maintenance spills over into outside the right-of-way, then you can exempt it. It's not like I'm going to build a house, therefore I'm going to start building my house in the right-of-way, and then, oops, look at this, it's all outside the right-of-way, so now I get to be exempt. That's all. I'm just making sure that we don't have some kind of a calamity like that.
Thank you, Commissioner Magyar. I don't think we would have that issue, just the way this is worded as maintenance and repair activities. So that, that means it's an existing facility that would be being maintained or replaced or repaired.
Any other questions from the commissioners on this?
I have one about the 25 cubic yards of volume. Is that something that comes out of Dogami, or arbitrary number that we came up with?
It is not something that Dogami recommended specifically. It's something that was just more like a common figure from codes for peer jurisdictions. So it's something that would have been reviewed probably by Dogami and DLCD, considering that it made it into other jurisdictions' codes. But they didn't specifically issue guidance saying this is an appropriate number.
I don't know, if you got to pick a number, it's, I have a problem with that. It's just, that came from 20, that's 2.5 dump trucks loads, so it's not a lot of material for an, I'm okay with it.
Yeah, and just for reference on some of these items that are on this list, it's not all of these activities are exempt from other permits.
That's right.
So like, to replace a culvert, you would need a grading permit, whether it's in a right-of-way or not, it would still require a grading permit. And then similarly, with the fill or excavation, we require a grading permit when the volume of fill is over, I'm kind of blanking on it, is it 20 cubic yards?
I think it's 30.
30 cubic yards.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to confirm what, if it is 30, maybe we should match them up, so we don't have one that's 5.
This is getting into discussion, and I have something to add to that. So if we could wait until after the extensive public comments we're likely to get. Are there any more questions about the substance of Planner Systems' report to us on this proposed ordinance change from any of the commissioners? If not, then I'll open the public testimony, and this is an opportunity for members of the public to make their positions known on this suggested amendment to ordinance 23-12. I don't see any public present here. If there's anybody online from the public that wishes to make testimony, please identify yourself now. And seeing none, I will take it on assumption that there is no public comment, nor any comment from a public agency. And so at this point, I'll close the public hearing, and we'll move on to a discussion amongst the planning commissioners on any of this. So does anyone wish to have a discussion around any of the points that have been presented to us this morning on 2312?
I have a question. I recall from the last, I don't know if it was in October of last year, we discussed this the first time around, and there was some concern that the county was going to require additional reporting by a geotechnical engineer to assure that all of the rules were followed. Is that still the case?
Thank you, Commissioner Magyar. Good question. So we did bring a larger update to you last year. That ultimately did not go to public hearing. The project was just put on hold. So we're working on doing some more community engagement coming up to get some public feedback. There were some questions about the data sources from Dogami that we were proposing to use, updating to kind of the latest and greatest LiDAR-based hazard mapping that they've done. But the Board of Commissioners had, at least one or two of the commissioners had concerns about the methodology that was used to develop those hazard maps. And they had a couple other concerns as well that I'm not thinking of at the moment, but our plan is to revisit that in the future. And so what you're referring to was a certificate of compliance, which would have required the geologist that prepared the report to sign off on the permit drawings and possibly also sign off on the construction as built. That's something that there was not support for at, I believe, at the Planning Commission or at the board level, and so that was pulled from that proposal. But the rest of that proposal has not moved forward. This exemptions list and the extension of the period the reports are valid up to 5 years, those items were included in last year's proposal. And again, we felt that those generally had support from your commission and from the board as well as from the public. And so we didn't want to hold this process up with some of the stickier issues that we'd like to go back and collect more public input on. So we felt it would be appropriate to move forward with the exemptions and the extension of the time period at this point.
Okay, that's a great answer. Can I just follow up and ask you to clarify? Earlier in the comment, you spoke about the commissioners, a couple commissioners having issue with the way the mapping was performed. That includes the raw data that's used to generate the maps themselves?
One of the specific concerns that came up was, for example, we have the Trails End material yard where they have big, mulch piles and rock piles and things like that. And those, because of the methodology to create the hazard maps using slope information from the LiDAR, those piles at Trails End were showing up as landslide hazards. And so based on the steepness of the slope. And so there were some citizens who observed that and raised a concern with a commissioner, and that concern was passed on to us. So that caused us to kind of take a pause and look at more areas that might be like that around the county and hopefully be able to develop a way to, you know, sort of ignore those areas that really shouldn't be part of the map. So that was one of the main things, really the main thing that I can recall from the discussion about issues with the LiDAR mapping.
All right, that's great. Thank you.
Any other commissioners have a point of discussion on this?
I would just say that, thank you for pulling up this grading and erosion control, permit, because I think we may help to get more consistent with that, where it's just very slight differences. It's 30 yards and 30 inches versus 24 inches and 5 yards. For, maybe we create some consistency.
Well, I'd like to chime in here, that I actually had a little bit of concern that 25 yards, maximum removal would be allowed, as I understand it, by these exemptions, even from the toe of a slide, which I think is probably have that without some oversight exactly on it is not advisable. Elsewhere on a property, even if it's where there's been active slides, I can see that. But from the toe of a slide, 25 yards could be enough to allow the slide to reactivate. And if that isn't something that was specifically in the Dogami document that kind of lays out model language for these things, I would recommend reconsidering that and just say something to the effect that it couldn't be within a certain distance of the property line, for one thing, so that you don't affect a neighboring property. Or moving 25 yards very close to a neighbor's property, you might trigger some instability on their property that would then migrate and move. And certainly from the toe of a slide, I'd have a great deal of reservation about doing that. So that's my opinion on it. I don't know if others have a few comments to make about that specifically, the location of the fill removal, or however you want to refer to it.
Valid points, and not exactly sure how we address it, you know. And,
Yeah, I know.
The language to get in there to prevent somebody from doing something stupid is hard to get in there. I mean, yeah.
How do you balance it without putting an unnecessary burden on 90% of the people who are just trying to do the project, you know?
Well, I think it wouldn't be too hard to put something in there about distance from a property line. That could be done probably pretty easily, and it's not going to be perfect, but it, you know, to say, well, you can't do it within 6 inches of the property line versus 10 feet or something, that could be a significant difference on the number of times you'd actually have a problem. So I think something reasonable could be developed for that. As far as the toe of a slide, I guess that would require that the slide be defined to know where you're talking about the toe being. Some slides, I guess, are mapped actually, but if it's just slide hazard territory, there's a lot of ground there that hasn't actually been mapped out as a particular slide. So that could be difficult, but I do feel you're kind of opening up the possibility of having some slope failures And I understand, people don't want to cause that because it impacts the property owner as well usually, so they're trying to avoid that, I'm sure, in most cases. But, I just know from, you know, I live here in Astoria, at least part of the time, and, I see what happens here, and a whole lot can have a slide on there that when they remove some stabilizing mass that's at the foot of a slide, it triggers it to begin creeping or moving again. So I'm not sure how to handle that. I don't know if you as a planner would have an idea on that, or if you recall anything that maybe Ogami had in that document that would help.
Well, one thing that could be done is, if there's support for changing this to 30 cubic yards, then, you know, we would be looking at anything that's under 30 cubic yards, basically not needing a geologic hazard permit or a grading permit. We could potentially add a requirement for grading permits for excavation or fill that's less than 30 cubic yards in a geologic hazard area. So right now, any excavation, any amount of excavation or fill in a geologic hazard area requires a geotechnical report and a geohazard permit. This exemption would remove that requirement, and no review would be required, not even a grading permit, until you get to that 30 cubic yard figure. So a potential compromise could be to require a grading permit, but not a geologic hazard permit for excavation or fill less than 30 cubic yards in identified geohazard areas. And that way, there would still be a degree to which those projects are reviewed. They are reviewed by the county engineer. And so he's not a geotechnical engineer, but does have the skills to review those kinds of projects that are, you know, smaller scale excavation and fill, and would be able to identify what the toe of a slope is, and to be able to look at the proximity to other properties and raise any concerns with, you know, affecting someone else's adjacent property. I don't know, Gail, if you have any other thoughts or suggestions on that.
Yeah, not off the top of my head, no.
It's not exactly off the top of one's head fix for this, but, I appreciate the idea you just presented, and maybe that would help to limit the likelihood of something like this happening.
Right, so you're still, you know, you would still be alleviating the need for someone to go to a geologist to accomplish the project, but they would still have to get a permit, and it would be reviewed by the county engineer.
I would prefer to go the other route where property line. The idea is that not a have a slide on your own.
Yeah, but they move off a property.
Well, that's the thing, if they move off the property, if we have some sort of, within 50 feet of a property line or something.
Yeah.
Something.
We had a situation here in town where a house, another house, a year or two ago, they moved right off of their lot. Now, in rural land, you know, you're talking bigger pieces of land, and you can, maybe, when you're thinking about it, you think of quite a lot of space, and there could be a slide that's moving, say, on your property or my property, and it's not affecting anyone else, but,
Yeah, that was gonna be, one of my comments is, the way the mapping is done, which is part of your property is in this. I could have a corner of one parcel that has overlaps into geohazard. And on that same tax lot, I could be a quarter mile away. Project,
Mhm.
really,
Hey.
well,
Jeremy, you're cutting out pretty bad. I want to hear what you have to say, but every other word is what we're hearing. Can you speak up? I really want to hear what you have to say.
sorry, Gail was beeping me. What I was saying was that the flip side of the, doing the property line thing is, or where, I don't know how to find the balance, but just another, angle is, you know, out our way, I could have a corner of one tax lot that has, part of the geohazard overlay on it, and I could still be on that same tax lot and be a quarter mile away to do some small excavation project. So that's the flip side is, how, you know, how do we find the balance where, you know, most of these properties are gonna be, you know, bigger, where there still is the ability to affect your neighbor if you did the wrong thing, but I think it's less likely than it would be, you know, if you're on Alameda and excavated 25 yards of material. That's a problem. That's a whole different scenario than if you're talking, you know, parcels that are, you know, 50, 100 acres plus.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's the idea of staying within such a distance of another property line, of another property owner, because if it's your own adjacent property, maybe
Right.
you're willing to take the risk, but
Right.
But I agree with Jeremy completely on that. You know, I've been a part of several properties where one side of the property, it's adjacent to another owner, has nothing to do with the geological overlay, but a half a mile away, on the other side, the other property owner does. So if I'm gonna excavate on one side of a property where there's no overlay, then do I still have to go through the full permit process because it's closer to a property line that is completely flat? I mean, I don't agree with all of the overlays that they're recommending with this new LiDAR system, because I know properties and had several people bring it up to me to bring it up in meetings that their properties have no geological hazards on them, but with the new LiDAR system and the way that the blanket system's gonna go, is it's gonna cause a lot of problems for a lot of people that really don't have any overlays on their property. But they're adding more and more what ifs, because we have properties in Astoria, which I agree, you shouldn't be able to just go in the hill and start excavating, because that could cause problems, a domino effect all the way up or down the hill. But if you're out in Lewis and Clark or Youngs River or anywhere else, Napa, wherever else, it's completely flat, but there's some sort of a hazard somewhere on the property that may or may not exist, that now you have to go through and have, you know, all these geotechnical engineers and everything else at a very expensive cost to the property owner if you want to do anything on your property.
If I could, I'd like to make one clarification, which is, a geologic hazard permit is only required if the land disturbing activity, so the excavation or the fill, is in the overlay boundary. So if just a corner of your tax lot is affected by the overlay and you're working a quarter mile away, no geologic hazard permit is gonna be required. It's only if you're working in the area that's actually mapped with a hazard. So it doesn't automatically apply the requirement to the entire property. Permit requirement is only for land disturbing activities that are happening in the mapped hazard area.
And I have a question for you regarding that exact comment. So if I own a piece of property, say I own a 10 miles by 10 miles square, and we all know that these maps, you know, it says on there everywhere, even on the Clatsop County web maps, that the property lines are approximate. What is the process if you do not believe that you pertain to that geological hazard that has been overlaid onto your property? Do you have to prove that it's not there, or does the county or state, is it their burden of proof that it does exist? How does that go about? Is it gonna cost the landowner all this money to go and hire everybody that they need to do and fight the state or county or whatever it is? Or does the county have to prove that that overlay does exist?
So there is a waiver process that folks can go through to get a waiver to the requirement to get a geologic hazard permit. the waiver needs to be something that's recommended by a certified engineering geologist or a registered geologist. I will say we have, you know, a lot of different overlays and that we use, and I think all of them are generalized in nature. So we have flood hazard maps, we have wetlands, and we have geologic hazards that are all mapped. Those all can trigger permit requirements, and in all of those cases, there is a process that people can go through to refine the actual on-the-ground location of the boundary of the wetland or the flood hazard or the geologic hazard. But in all of those cases, someone qualified has to make that determination. So it would be a surveyor or a professional wetland scientist or a certified engineering geologist in this case. So, you know, the burden is still on the person applying to develop the property, to go through that process to to find a qualified person to make that determination. So, and then the other thing I'll say is the data sources we currently use and have been using since 1980 were published by Dogami in 1974 and 1979. And if you can imagine the technology that existed then and compare that to the technology we have today, there's quite a difference. And so while the proposed update to the hazard mapping is not perfect, it is understood to be more refined than what we're currently using. And so those boundaries are more accurate. And one of the things that we'll be presenting to your commission as well as to the public when we bring this topic of updating our maps back up is that excuse me, I lost my train of thought there, but that the boundaries are going to be more refined, that it was done using better technology. And so we actually, here's where I was going, we have a side-by-side comparison of the acreage that's currently in our geologic hazard overlay mapped as landslide hazard versus the new acreage. And they're relatively close. It is going to be an increase, but they're relatively close. And again, I think generally it's fair to say that the maps that we would be using are more accurate and more refined than the ones that were produced in 1974 and 1979.
Okay, I appreciate all that. That was good discussion on that. However, I want to remind the commissioners, we're taking up a relatively small piece of the pie this morning with this adding exemptions, and I don't think we should get into a discussion about overall about the geologic hazards overlay. We'll have time to do that when it's brought before us, I think in the next couple of months or whatever the schedule has for that. But this morning we're taking up this particular amendment that's been laid out here for us, and it's mainly the exemptions shown there on page 9 and the fact that if we recommend to send this on to the commissioners, we'd also be including the extension to from 2 years to 5 years for the acceptance of a geologic report. So if we can stay on those, I don't know if anybody has further discussion they want to bring up on the exemptions, and specifically on this issue about fill removal and proximity to slide toes and that kind of thing.
Yes, my only thought, just because you have a permit for something does not necessarily make it so nothing bad is going to happen. Also, if you do something without a permit, as an exemption, it doesn't absolve you of any liability, cause something that may occur to affect your neighbor's property either. So, I mean, I'm okay with how it's written. No way to prevent every wrong from going wrong either. Make valid points. I don't know how we can prevent that easily. validity in having some exemptions, to make the process smoother and easier. I think that to have consistencies with the grading permit makes sense to me. I would prefer to see that. Okay with how it's written and I agree with the Public Works recommendation that we should be able to extend outside the existing right-of-way. I think that's fine. That's just my thoughts.
Anybody else have some kind of wrap-up thoughts that they have on this? All right, well, it sounds like, there's kind of a consensus building around changing that 25-yard limit here in, item 5 and 6, making that 30, which, I believe we have consensus on, but we'll see if we can get a motion here. As to my concern about the slide toes and all that, I guess I just don't like legal proceedings and lawsuits to settle things, and appreciate that the county wants to have some provisions in place that make that much less likely. So that's where I'm coming from on it, but I agree in principle with most of what Commissioner Johnson has stated, and also Commissioner Linder, and so I guess I just ask at this point if anybody feels like making a motion on this matter of whether to send this to the Board of Commissioners with our recommendation that they approve the amendments to 23-12.
I will make a motion that we recommend approval of ordinance 23-12, the geologic hazard overlay exemptions, with a couple further amendments that we also increase items 5 and 6 to 30 inches instead of the 2 feet in depth, and increase the cubic yards to 30 yards on both 5 and 6, and also strike the half of item 10, provided the work does not extend outside the existing right-of-way boundary.
All right, it's been moved by Commissioner Johnson in a rather long and detailed, slightly amended version of what we have in front of us here for the exemptions, primarily focusing, and I'm paraphrasing here, primarily focusing on changing the 25-yard limits in sections 5 and 6 there, making them 30, and then item 7 changing 2 feet height to 30 inches, and in section 10 there, including the strikeout of the last phrase of that item, taking out the mention of the existing right-of-way. So I hope that's clear enough. Yes, I have
One question for clarification. Thank you, Chair Farrar. Commissioner Johnson, item 7 deals with retaining walls up to 2 feet. Is that one that you also wanted to change to be consistent with the grading permit requirement, which comes in at 30 inches?
Yes, if that's at 30 as well. Okay.
Okay, so, kind of not following procedure to the letter of the law here, but I think we know, if anybody's unclear about what the motion is, please so state, but I'll ask for a second at this point.
I'll second the motion.
You were preceded by Commissioner Linder, so, it's been moved and seconded that we, recommend to the Board of Commissioners to adopt the, amendments to Ordinance 23-12 as provided for in our packet this morning with the amendments detailed by Commissioner Johnson in his original motion that would change the amount of material that could be excavated or filled, and the height of a retaining wall, as well as accepting the original amendment made by Planning Commission staff to remove the clause that recommending that the work does not extend outside the existing right-of-way boundary. That's been removed. So a cumbersome motion, but if anyone has a question, please ask it now. Otherwise, I'm going to ask for a voice vote on this.
Yeah, I've got a statement. I agree with the right-of-way language. I don't agree with the changing of the volumes. So I'm going to vote no on this because it's a blanket acceptance with changes. So since I'm not willing to accept all the changes, I'm just going to have to vote no.
Right, anybody else? All right, if we could have a voice vote on this. Please.
Roll call?
Roll call, okay,
I'm sorry.
sorry. Vice Chair Powers,
Aye.
Commissioner Magyar,
No.
Commissioner Pritchard,
Aye.
Commissioner Johnson,
Aye.
Commissioner Linder,
Aye.
Commissioner Krausher,
Aye.
Chair Farrar.
Nay. It's been voted, I think 5-2 to approve sending the matter up to the Board of Commissioners with a recommendation of them accepting the changes, the amendments to Ordinance 2312, Geologic Hazards Overlay Exemptions. So that was good discussion on that, and minor, possibly differences on small points, but overall, maybe out of order here for me to say, but I appreciate the work that the planning staff is doing to make our regulations easier for people to do small things. So I'm in favor of a lot that was in there, but
Thank you, Chair Farrar. Thank you, Commissioners.
so next up is discussion of work session, and I was kind of looking for the topic of it. It looks like mostly what's left in our packet is some very extensive and actually very helpful information that I have a feeling our Director of Community Development had a lot to do with putting together. So are you going to do a sort of a presentation of this material, or was that just
Well, so we have a couple of items on here. We had hoped, first of all, to bring back a housing discussion, and we've been working with GIS, and literally the afternoon after the packet went out, we got the GIS information we had been waiting for, so we'll have that for you either in September or October. But then we do have our next item, which is the project status report for August. And so you'll see that there's a few new things on there, the two items that you heard today at your public hearing, and those will be going for a first public reading with the Board of Commissioners tomorrow evening. And then we've also added a new ordinance, Ordinance 2313. This is at the request of the Emergency Management Department for Clatsop County, and they have been working on a grant to be able to place storage structures for emergency supplies in different zones. The state statute has it called out specifically as uses in our farm, or not our farm zones, but our forest zones, and it's a conditional use under state statute, so we can't change that. But when we added that type of use to the code, we never bothered to add it to any of the other zoning districts. So now they're trying to do some work in Arch Cape, and just like short-term rentals, because we called it out in one district but not any others, we have to go back and amend the code to do that. So you'll be seeing that in September. And that's pretty much the project status report. Department of Land Conservation and Development did acknowledge the updates to goals 1 through 4, 6 through 14, and goal 19 back on July 25th. So that part of the comp plan update process is completed. So before I get too far into my director's report, I'll pause with the project status report and see if there are any questions for me.
Any questions from the virtual world here for our community development director? Not? I can't remember exactly where my question falls in this. I have a note to ask you about, on the RFPs, on page 21, so is that part of our, director's report?
It is.
Oh,
yeah,
okay,
but-
well, I'll wait till you,
If we're ready, I didn't have any questions on the project status report for the month, so we can move into that if everyone's
Yeah.
ready. Okay. So, I talked briefly about the fact that Department of Land Conservation and Development had, acknowledged the 15 goals or 14 goals that we sent over to them. So that part is done. We had the deadline for the economic opportunity analysis request for proposals, which is an RFP. Those were due on August 1st. We did receive 2 proposals, which are being evaluated right now. And then, I don't have the schedule right in front of me, I apologize. But I know our evaluation committee is meeting on August 18th to rank the proposals. And then we'll bring that to the board, for final approval of the contract and award of the contract. So, and I think that will occur in either late August or early September. I don't remember the exact date. We have 2 other RFPs that are out. One is,
question on
yeah.
that one. When is it expected that the report will be completed?
we have asked that the work be completed by September 24th or end of September 2024. About a year-ish. And then the 2 other RFPs, one is to update goals 16 and 17, which covers estuarine resources and coastal shorelands, and goal 18, which addresses beaches and dunes. Both of these goals have a lot of technical information in them, and they really have not been updated since the 1980s. Again, there have been a few updates to, I think, goal 16 with regard to dredge material management out in the Columbia River. But this deals a lot with dredging, habitat, the whole estuary system, both of the Columbia River, the Nicanicum, and Furicola Creek. And these are the 3 estuaries that are recognized in our county by the state. And so back in the early 80s, the state spent a lot of money to, help develop these plans and provide this information. They're not doing the same thing this go around. So we are looking to get those updated as well. The deadline for those submittals is August 14th, and then we will be meeting with the evaluation committee on the 28th of August, and then from there ranking the proposals, and then taking the final recommendation for the award of contract to the board, probably in late September. And then those projects were each given until October 31st of 2024 to be completed.
Any further discussion of, the other items that were included here in the packet, or are those more informational? The match
I can
timber
just go over briefly some of this, because there is a lot of information in here. Just to keep you updated on the FEMA, BIAP NEPA review process, Tillamook County has formed a coalition, and has taken the lead on this, where they are looking for jurisdictions, local governments, agencies, organizations to join their coalition, with a contribution of $5,000 to $10,000 per year with a 2-year commitment. The funding is to be used, if needed, to include possible litigation. And so we have given this information to the board. The board has not had any discussions about this. They have not given any direction to staff regarding joining or not joining the coalition, and we just have provided that information basically for your information, just to let you know what's going on. The Housing Task Force continues to meet. We have Alyssa Gertler, who's our Clatsop County Housing Manager. She has taken the lead on preparing a grant. DLCD has quite a bit of funding available right now for housing assistance. And so the county and the 5 cities are going to be submitting, or actually have submitted at this point, the grant application to do a buildable lands inventory, a housing inventory, and then what's being called an infrastructure readiness inventory. And what we're trying to do is primarily get the city of Astoria set up for their housing capacity analysis that they're required to do now that they've crossed that 10,000 population threshold. But we also want to bring the other cities and our rural communities, so Westport, Swenson, Napa, Miles Crossing, Jeffers Gardens, Arch Cape, into this process as well, because these are the areas where we have opportunities to do more with housing, because it's less restrictive control and it's where development is encouraged. And also to make sure that everybody in the county is using the same data and looking at the same problem with the same information. So it is a joint agreement, but Clatsop County has taken the lead on submitting that paperwork. I don't think we will know until later this year if we're going to receive any funding. It sounded fairly promising from our discussions with Department of Land Conservation and Development that the grant may receive some funding, but again, it's a statewide process and we just don't know the outcome at this point. Any questions about housing grant?
Can you describe a little more fully what the Regional Housing Readiness Infrastructure Inventory?
Yeah, I think it's intended to look, water, sewer capacity, things like that. I don't know how deep it's really going to dive into transportation, so I don't foresee traffic counts, but I think it was primarily the water, sewer infrastructure.
But the inclusion of the word readiness there makes it sound like it's keep it going in times of some regional problem, some storm or some natural hazard interrupt. Is that more what it's about, or is it about do we have enough to meet our future? Do we have enough water? Do we have enough?
Yeah, it's are we ready to serve the housing that we're going to need to build, and that the state is going to tell us we're going to need to build. So it's really to determine how much capacity we have now, how much capacity we're going to need, and then how do we bridge that gap.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, that sounds like it's quite needed at this time. Go forward.
Then just a couple more items to kind of keep you apprised of what planning staff is working on. DLCD right now is kind of flush with cash, and as are some of the federal agencies, and there's a lot of money being offered to anybody who can put together the notices of intent quickly enough. So another one that community development in Clatsop County will be pursuing is this code audit that DLCD is working on to find ways in your code, both building codes and zoning codes, to make mass timber construction more acceptable within communities. And I think it's primarily aimed at, communities that were severely impacted by wildfires in 2020, but it is open to everyone statewide. And I know that, especially Commissioner Thompson has been a very strong advocate of cross-laminated timber and mass timber, and so we're gonna be pursuing that, to see if we can get some assistance with our codes. You had asked last month for a presentation by, our Emergency Management Director, so he will be here on September 12th to talk to you, about the work that his department is doing. If you do have any specific questions that you want to have him address, if you could just email those to me or let me know somehow by August 31st, so I can give him time to prepare. And then finally, last month, we closed out the fiscal year 22-23 work plan, and I know I had said that I would send you this year's current work plan, so that's included in your packet as well for your review. We will do our first quarter review and audit of it in October, at your October meeting, so. And that's everything I had in my report.
Well, thank you for that very thorough report and bringing us up to date. And that brings us to the end of our formal agenda. Is there any good of the order comment that anybody would like to interject at this time? Not? I'll just say, enjoy the nice, warm summer we've been having. And hopefully it won't be too much drier. And I'll adjourn the meeting then at, about, 11:12.